The bus ride to the village was uneventful, though the scenery was spectacular. Rolling hills gave way to dense woods as the road narrowed and twisted through the countryside. Jack, slouched against the window, watched the towering trees blur together as the sunlight dappled the interior of the bus. The driver, a man in his 60s with weathered hands and a cigarette permanently perched on his lips, had said little during the journey except for the occasional grunt when Jack asked for directions. "This village, Drakemeyer," the driver finally said as they neared the last bend. "You're here for the summer, huh? Writing some kind of paper?" Jack nodded. "Research project. I'm studying mythology and legends of isolated communities. Figured this place might have some interesting stories." The driver chuckled, a dry sound that rattled like gravel in his throat. "Oh, you'll get stories, all right? Just don't let them get in your head." He didn't elaborate, but Jack caught the way his eyes darted to the dark forest lining the road. The village of Drakemeyer was quaint, almost picturesque. Cobblestone streets wound through clusters of small stone cottages, each with thatched roofs and flower boxes brimming with vibrant blooms. The villagers watched him with cautious curiosity as he unloaded his bag and equipment. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't warmth either, more like a quiet wariness reserved for outsiders. His summer rental, a modest cottage on the edge of the village, was charming in its own way. The windows were small but let in enough light, and the smell of wood and earth filled the air. Jack spent the first couple of days settling in and chatting with the locals when he could. They weren't talkative, but they softened slightly when he mentioned his interest in folklore. That was how he first heard about the forest. An older woman named Greta, who ran the only general store in the village, warned him the moment he brought it up. "The forest isn't safe, young man. Not after dark. People don't go in there. Not unless they've got no other choice." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Why? What's out there?" Greta's hand froze over the cash register, and her expression tightened. "It's not something I should be talking about. Just take my advice. Don't go in after sunset." But Jack was persistent, and after a few conversations with other villagers, he pieced together the local legend. They called it the Shadow. It wasn't something people could see, at least not at first. It made its presence known in subtle ways. The prickling sensation of being watched, whispers carried by the wind, an unnatural silence that swallowed the usual sounds of the forest. Those who lingered too long, ignoring the warnings, reported hearing the shadow speak directly to them. Not many survived such encounters. The lucky ones returned, though they were never the same. Others, well, no one knew what happened to the others. For Jack, it was irresistible. A legend like that could elevate his project into something extraordinary. He decided to explore the forest the very next day. That morning, Jack packed his bag with everything he thought he might need: his camera, voice recorder, and laptop for cataloging his findings, along with a notebook for observations. As the sun climbed higher, he made his way to the edge of the village, where the towering trees loomed like sentinels. The locals avoided his gaze as he passed, and one man even muttered a prayer under his breath. Jack couldn't help but smile. The fear only made the story more compelling. The forest, at first, was ordinary enough. Birds chirped overhead, and the underbrush crackled beneath his boots. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, painting the ground with golden patches. He spent hours wandering, photographing the moss-covered trunks and scribbling notes about the eerie beauty of the place. But as the day wore on, he began to notice the quiet. It crept in slowly, like a tide receding, until the birdsong vanished entirely. The rustle of leaves in the wind seemed to muffle itself, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. Jack glanced at his watch. It was late afternoon, still plenty of time before sunset. Even so, the silence unnerved him, and he decided to head back. On the way home, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. It was subtle at first, like the sensation of being watched from a distance. Jack tried to shrug it off, chalking it up to nerves and an overactive imagination. But when he reached the village, he couldn't shake the sense of relief that washed over him as he stepped onto the cobblestone streets. That night, he played back the audio from his recorder, hoping to hear the ambient sounds of the forest. For the most part, it was uneventful until he reached the later recordings. There, buried beneath the crackle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig, was a faint whisper. Jack leaned closer to the speaker, straining to hear. The whisper was too soft to make out, but it was unmistakably there. He replayed the clip 3 times, trying to convince himself it was just the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like words. When he checked the footage from his camera, his unease deepened. There were shadows in the distance, darting between the trees, shapes that shouldn't have been there. He didn't remember seeing anything unusual while filming. It had been just him, alone in the forest. Or so he thought. The next morning, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the recordings. The whisper was so faint, but it clung to his mind like a thorn in his thoughts. What was it? The shadows in the footage, too, they were impossible to ignore. He'd gone over the video frame by frame, but they didn't look like animals. They moved too smoothly, too deliberately. He decided to return to the forest that afternoon. This time, he would stay longer. The walk into the woods felt different from the day before. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, and the silence began earlier. Even the crunch of his boots on the ground felt muted, as if the forest were swallowing the sound. About an hour in, Jack stopped to set up his equipment. He positioned the camera to face a cluster of particularly tall, gnarled trees. As he adjusted the tripod, that prickling sensation returned, the feeling of being watched. He glanced around but saw nothing. Still, his stomach churned uneasily. "All right," he muttered, pressing record. "Let's see what you've got." Jack stayed until the edge of dusk. The light shifted into a bruised purple, and long shadows stretched across the forest floor. That same heaviness hung in the air, like the weight of a storm that hadn't broken yet. His chest felt tight, and the quiet pressed down on his ears. Then, just as he was about to pack up, he thought he heard something. A faint rustling, coming from somewhere behind him. He froze, straining to hear more. But the sound didn't repeat. Slowly, he turned to face the direction it had come from, scanning the trees. There was nothing there, or so he told himself. Jack made it back to the village just as night fell, his pulse still racing. When he reviewed the recordings later that evening, his stomach dropped. The whisper was louder this time, still too faint to understand, but it seemed closer somehow. And the camera? It had captured movement again, shadows flitting through the trees. But this time, one of the shapes stopped. It lingered in the distance, unmoving, as though it was watching him. Jack couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the whispers in his mind. Over and over, he told himself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe it was the wind, or the acoustics of the forest playing tricks on his recorder. And the shadows? Just tricks of the light, exaggerated by his camera's low resolution. But deep down, he didn't believe that. By the next evening, his curiosity had overtaken his fear. He had to know more. The legend said the shadow appeared to those who stayed after sunset. If he wanted answers, he needed to push further. So, for the first time, Jack walked into the forest in the late afternoon with no intention of leaving before dark. The forest felt alive as the sun dipped below the horizon, but not in the way a vibrant forest should. The air was thick, heavy, like it clung to him with invisible hands. The trees seemed taller, their branches curling toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But Jack pressed on, clutching his voice recorder tightly in his hand. He found a small clearing and set up his camera, aiming it toward the deepest part of the woods. Then he sat down on a rock, flipping on his recorder. The only sounds were his own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The minutes ticked by. Then he felt it, that sensation of being watched. It was more intense than before, an almost physical pressure on the back of his neck. He turned slowly, scanning the forest, but saw nothing but shadows. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice breaking the silence like a gunshot. The forest didn't answer, but the quiet deepened, and Jack's chest tightened. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. And then he heard it, a whisper, not through the recorder this time. He heard it with his own ears. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was there. A single word. Jack. He froze. His blood ran cold. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The whisper came again, softer now, almost playful. "Jack." His heart pounded as he grabbed his camera and recorder, shoving them into his bag. He bolted in the direction he thought led back to the village, but the forest seemed different. The trees crowded closer together, their twisted branches tangling above him, blotting out the moonlight. The path he'd followed earlier was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of gnarled roots and brambles. The whisper followed him, growing louder. More voices joined it now, overlapping in a chaotic murmur that seemed to come from all directions. Then, ahead of him, something moved. A figure stepped out from the shadows, its shape barely discernible in the darkness. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its edges blurry, like smoke struggling to hold a solid form. Jack stopped dead in his tracks, his breath hitching in his throat. The figure didn't move closer. It just stood there, watching. He couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but he felt its gaze, sharp and unrelenting, piercing through him like needles. Panic overtook him. He stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but he scrambled to his feet, refusing to take his eyes off the figure. When he looked up, it was gone. But the whispers weren't. Jack ran. His legs burned, his chest heaved, and every breath felt like fire in his lungs. The whispers followed, swirling around him like a storm. They weren't just calling his name anymore. They were speaking fragments of sentences, scattered and disjointed, words he couldn't piece together. But the tone was unmistakable. Sounded like mocking. He glanced over his shoulder as he ran, half expecting to see the dark figure chasing him. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. The trail twisted and turned unnaturally, the forest seeming to shift around him. The air was thick, humid, suffocating. Every direction looked the same. He stopped to catch his breath, clutching a tree for support. His hands trembled, his pulse pounding so loudly in his ears that it drowned out the whispers for a moment. He looked down at his watch, hoping to anchor himself to reality, but the hands were frozen, stuck at the time he'd first entered the woods. "Damn it," he muttered, shaking it. That was when he noticed something strange. The trees around him, they were the same trees he had passed minutes ago. He recognized the distinct, knotted trunk of one in particular, its bark curling back to reveal pale wood beneath. He had gone in a circle. No, no, no. Jack fumbled for his phone, pulling it out of his pocket with trembling hands. No signal. The screen flickered briefly before the battery icon drained completely, though he knew it had been fully charged earlier. The phone shut off, leaving him in darkness save for the dim light of the moon filtering through the canopy. A branch snapped behind him. Jack froze. Slowly, he turned, his heart thundering in his chest. The dark figure was back. It was closer this time, no more than 20 feet away, standing motionless between the trees. It seemed darker than the shadows around it, as if it absorbed the light rather than reflected it. The whispers grew louder, sharper, and for the first time, Jack could make out words. "Why are you here?" The voice wasn't coming from the figure. It was in his head, clear, resonant, and cold. Jack took a shaky step back. I didn't mean to." "Liar," the voice interrupted, a growl laced beneath its words. Jack's knees buckled, and he stumbled backward again. The figure moved this time, taking a single step forward. Its movements were wrong, jagged and unnatural, like a glitch in reality. "Leave," the voice hissed. "I'm trying," Jack yelled, his voice cracking. The forest erupted with sound. The whispers became screams, overlapping and chaotic, deafening in their intensity. Jack clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The noise was inside him, a piercing cacophony that made his vision blur and his legs shake. The figure raised a shadowy hand, pointing at him. The screams stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. Then it spoke again. Run. Jack didn't need to be told twice. Jack's feet pounded against the uneven forest floor as he ran blindly through the dark. His bag slammed against his back with every step, the equipment inside rattling like a warning bell. The path was gone now, if it had ever been there at all, and the trees seemed to shift and crowd together, their branches clawing at him as he passed. The voice echoed in his mind as he ran. Run. Even though the figure wasn't chasing him, Jack could feel its presence, close and suffocating, as though it were breathing down his neck. The forest itself felt alive, conspiring against him. Roots jutted up from the ground, tripping him. Brambles tore at his clothes and skin. He stumbled and fell more times than he could count, his palms raw from catching himself against rough bark. Then he stopped abruptly. Ahead of him there was light, not moonlight, but a faint, flickering glow, like firelight. It danced through the trees, casting long, shifting shadows. Jack hesitated. It didn't make sense. He was deep in the forest, far from the village, and he'd seen no sign of other people. But the glow was there, undeniable, and in his panic, it felt like a beacon. He stumbled toward it, his breath ragged, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting slightly with each step. As he drew closer, the glow brightened, and the whispers faded into the background. The clearing appeared suddenly, like stepping into another world. At its center was a ring of stones, scorched black as if by fire. Inside the ring, a faint blue flame burned, small but steady, its light casting strange, shifting patterns on the surrounding trees. The air here was cooler, almost cold, and for the first time since the whispers began, Jack felt a sliver of calm. But it didn't last. As he approached the flame, something caught his eye, carvings on the stones surrounding it. They weren't random scratches or weathered cracks. They were deliberate symbols, intricate and angular, unlike anything he'd seen before. He crouched down, running his fingers over one of the stones. The second his skin touched it, the whispers roared back to life. Jack stumbled backward as the blue flame flared, its light intensifying. The ground beneath him trembled, and the whispers seemed to coalesce into a single voice, louder and clearer than before. You shouldn't be here. Jack's head snapped up. The figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, its form even darker against the glow of the flame. This time it wasn't alone. More shapes emerged from the shadows, surrounding him. They were just as blurry and indistinct, but they were there, their presence pressing in on him from all sides. The voice spoke again, echoing through his mind. You were warned. Jack's vision swam, the world tilting as nausea clawed at his stomach. He stumbled toward the flame, desperate for some kind of protection, but as he drew closer, it flickered and began to fade. No, no, no. Jack reached out, but the flame winked out completely, plunging him into darkness. The darkness was absolute. Jack's eyes strained, desperate for even the faintest glimmer of light, but there was nothing. Just the pitch-black void and the oppressive silence that followed the extinguished flame. Then came the sound. It wasn't the whispers this time, it was breathing. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, like something massive was inhaling the very air around him. Jack froze, his own breath shallow and trembling. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere. Then a voice, low and guttural, rumbled in his head. You don't belong here. Jack staggered back, tripping over the stones of the ring. The figures that had surrounded him moments before were still there, their forms shifting and undulating in the darkness like smoke caught in an unseen wind. They weren't moving closer, but their presence pressed against him, suffocating and inescapable. I didn't mean to, Jack stammered, his voice shaking as he scrambled to his feet. I was just researching. I didn't. Lies. The voice was deafening, each word reverberating in his skull like thunder. Jack clutched his head, the pain sharp and blinding. The figures in the shadows began to move now, circling him slowly, their forms flickering in and out of solidity. One of them broke from the circle, gliding closer to him. It stopped just feet away, and though its features were indistinct, Jack felt its eyes, burning hollow pits, locked on his face. The whispers returned, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. They weren't words anymore. They were screams. Jack backed away, his movements frantic, but no matter how far he moved, the figure stayed just as close, like a shadow stitched to him. The voice spoke again, its tone colder now. You were warned, yet you stayed. The forest began to shift around him. The ground trembled. The trees groaned as though alive, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The figures multiplied, emerging from every corner of the dark, their sheer numbers overwhelming. Jack turned and ran, but it didn't feel like running anymore. His movements were sluggish, as if the air itself had thickened, dragging him down. His legs felt like they were moving through water, every step heavier than the last. And still, the whispers followed, filling his mind with chaos. Just when he thought he couldn't move another inch, the ground beneath him seemed to vanish. Jack stumbled, falling forward onto his hands and knees. The dirt felt cold and damp, sticking to his skin, and the air around him was freezing now, his breath visible in short, frantic bursts. Slowly, he lifted his head and his stomach dropped. The dark figure was right in front of him, towering over him like an obelisk of shadow. Its edges rippled and shifted, as if it were barely holding its shape. For the first time, it leaned down toward him, and though it had no face, Jack felt its presence burrow into his very being. The whispers silenced, and then the voice came, low and calm, but filled with a terrifying finality. You belong to us now. Jack tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand, its long, spindly fingers reaching for him. The figure's outstretched hand loomed closer, its fingers impossibly long and clawed, as if they could tear through reality itself. Jack's body refused to move, paralyzed by the sheer weight of its presence. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything. But he was frozen, a puppet held by invisible strings. The air around him grew colder still, and a deep, bone-chilling dread settled over him, unlike anything he had ever felt. He could barely breathe, every inhale sharp and shallow, the darkness pressing down on his chest like a vice. When the figure's hand was mere inches from his face, it stopped. Jack flinched, his heart hammering wildly, but the figure didn't touch him. Instead, it tilted its head, as though observing him, studying him. Then, without warning, the whispers returned, louder, sharper, piercing his skull like shards of glass. Jack doubled over, clutching his head as the sound overwhelmed him, flooding his mind with words that didn't make sense. Fragments of sentences, names he didn't recognize, and phrases in a language he couldn't understand all melded together into a cacophony of torment. But beneath it all, one word repeated, over and over, cutting through the noise like a blade. Stay. Jack managed to gasp out a single, desperate plea. Please, let me go. The figure didn't respond, but the voices around him did, rising in unison, a chorus of overlapping tones, some low and guttural, others high and shrill. You came, you stayed, you are ours. Jack's vision blurred, the edges of the world warping and twisting. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, no longer solid but rippling like water. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out and he collapsed onto his hands and knees once more. The figure's hand finally moved, but instead of touching him, it hovered just above his head. Jack felt an unbearable pressure in his skull, as if his very thoughts were being pulled from him. Memories flashed before his eyes in rapid succession. His childhood, his friends, his family, moments he hadn't thought about in years. Then, the voice spoke again, softer this time, but no less menacing. You cannot leave. You belong to the forest. The realization hit Jack like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a threat, it was a sentence. Whatever the shadow was, whatever the forest had become, it wasn't going to let him go. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Jack forced himself to move. He reached into his bag, fumbling blindly until his fingers closed around his camera. It was a feeble plan, but if he could record something, anything, maybe someone would find it. Maybe someone would know what happened to him. He pressed the record button just as the figure leaned closer, its shadow enveloping him completely. Then everything went black. Jack woke to silence. For a moment he thought he was dead. The air was still and cold, the kind of cold that seeped into his bones. Slowly, he became aware of the damp ground beneath him, the sharp smell of earth and decay filling his nostrils. His body ached, and his head throbbed as if it had been split open and hastily stitched back together. He opened his eyes and saw nothing. The darkness was so complete it felt as though his vision had been stripped away. Panic surged through him, and he scrambled to sit up, his hands sinking into the wet dirt. The whispers were gone. The oppressive weight that had pinned him down earlier had lifted, but the silence that replaced it felt just as unnatural. It wasn't peace, it was the kind of silence that hid something waiting, watching. Jack's breathing quickened as he patted himself down, searching for his bag. To his surprise, it was still slung over his shoulder. Shaking fingers pulled the zipper open, and he rummaged through it, desperate for anything that might ground him in reality. The camera. He pulled it out, pressing the power button. The screen flickered to life, its pale glow cutting through the darkness just enough for him to see the forest floor around him. The sight made his stomach turn. The ground was covered in twisted roots that seemed to writhe and coil like living things. Blackened patches of earth radiated outward in strange, unnatural patterns, as if something had burned the ground in shapes too precise to be random. And then there were the trees. They were closer than before, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching down like skeletal arms. The bark was slick with something dark and wet, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the trees themselves were leaning toward him, crowding in. He turned the camera around, aiming it into the darkness behind him. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless void between the trees. Then something moved. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat. The screen flickered as the camera struggled to focus, but the shape was unmistakable. A figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still in the distance. He lowered the camera, turning to look with his own eyes. Nothing. But when he raised the camera again, the figure was closer. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't understand what he was seeing. Was it the camera malfunctioning? His own mind playing tricks on him? Or was the figure only visible through the lens? "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. He fumbled with the buttons, switching the camera to video mode, and hit record. The lens picked up movement again. More shapes now, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows between the trees. They were all the same, their edges blurry and shifting, their forms human but wrong. The whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder. Jack didn't wait to see what would happen next. He grabbed his bag and bolted, the camera still clutched tightly in one hand. The light from the screen bounced wildly as he ran, illuminating brief flashes of the forest floor and the encroaching shadows behind him. The forest didn't feel endless this time. Instead, it felt like it was shrinking around him, the trees pressing closer together, the air growing thicker with each step. He ran until his legs burned, until his lungs felt like they would burst. And then he saw it, a faint light ahead, not blue like the flame he'd seen earlier, but warm and golden. It flickered through the trees like a beacon, pulling him forward. "Please," Jack gasped, his voice hoarse. "Please let this be real." He pushed himself harder, ignoring the searing pain in his muscles, his focus locked on the light. The whispers grew louder behind him, the sound clawing at his mind, but he didn't dare look back. Finally, he broke through the trees and stumbled into the clearing. What he saw stopped him cold. It wasn't the village. It wasn't safety. It was a cabin, a single, weathered structure, its windows glowing with the golden light he had seen from the forest. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the faint smell of wood smoke and something cooking reached his nose. But it didn't feel right. Something about the cabin was off, its presence too sudden, too convenient. It was as if the forest had placed it there just for him. Jack hesitated, standing at the edge of the clearing, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But where else could he go? Behind him, The whispers rose into a deafening crescendo, and the shadowy figures emerged from the treeline, closing in. Jack made his choice. He ran for the cabin door. Jack reached the cabin door just as the whispers behind him swelled into a maddening roar. Without thinking, he grabbed the handle and shoved the door open, slamming it shut behind him and throwing the bolt across. The sudden quiet was jarring. Inside, the cabin was warm, almost too warm, the air thick and suffused with the smell of wood smoke and something sweet, like syrup left too long in the sun. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light across the small room. The furniture was sparse. A worn armchair by the fire, a wooden table and chair, a faded rug covering part of the floor. It was strange. Too perfect. Too untouched. Jack leaned against the door, his chest heaving, trying to catch his breath. His eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail, every shadow. His mind screamed that none of this made sense. The cabin had no signs of life, no personal belongings, no marks of wear. Felt staged. And then he noticed the notebook. It lay open on the table, its pages yellowed and brittle. Jack hesitated, his instincts telling him not to touch it, but his curiosity got the better of him. He stepped forward, the floor creaking under his weight, and picked it up. The handwriting inside was jagged and uneven, as though the author had been writing in a frenzy. The words spilled across the pages in chaotic bursts, some lines scrawled over others, making it hard to read. But what Jack could make out made his blood run cold. The forest watches. The forest knows. The shadow is patient. He flipped to another page. Don't trust the light. Don't trust the path. The cabin is a trap. Jack's hands trembled, and the notebook slipped from his grip, falling to the floor with a dull thud. He backed away from the table, his pulse hammering in his ears. The air in the cabin suddenly felt wrong. The warmth was suffocating now, and the golden light from the fire seemed too bright, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. And then he heard it, a soft creak, coming from the corner of the room. Jack turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. There was nothing there, just the armchair empty and still. But the creak came again, louder this time, and the chair moved. Not much, just a slight shift, as though someone had leaned back into it. His camera was still in his hand, and he instinctively raised it, the lens focusing on the armchair. Through the screen, the chair wasn't empty. The figure sat there. It wasn't like the shadows in the forest. This figure was clearer, more defined. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over hollow features. Its eyes were dark pits, empty and staring, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The camera began to flicker, the screen glitching and distorting. Jack lowered it, expecting the figure to vanish, but it didn't. The thing in the chair slowly turned its head to face him. "Why did you come here?" it asked, its voice a low, raspy whisper. Jack stumbled back, his back hitting the door. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The figure rose from the chair, its movements stiff and jerky, like a puppet being forced to dance. It took a step toward him, and the cabin seemed to darken, the light from the fire dimming as shadows crept across the walls. "You can't leave," the figure rasped, its grin widening. "The forest doesn't let you leave." Jack's hand fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. His heart pounded as the figure drew closer, its hollow eyes locked on his. Then, without warning, the fire went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. And the whispers came back. The darkness in the cabin was absolute, swallowing everything. Jack pressed himself against the door, his hand clawing desperately at the handle, but it wouldn't move. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the forest had crept inside and taken hold of the walls, the floor, the very air around him. The whispers grew louder, filling every corner of the room, an overlapping chaos of voices. Some spoke his name, others laughed, a few wept, and then, cutting through it all, came the rasping voice of the figure. "You never should have come." Jack's legs trembled, threatening to give out beneath him. He could feel the figure's presence drawing closer, the air around him growing colder with every second. In a last desperate act, Jack raised his camera, using its dim screen to illuminate the room. The glow flickered weakly, but it was enough to see. The figure was inches from his face. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were voids, infinite and devouring, pulling him in. The grotesque grin on its face twisted further, impossibly wide, the corners of its mouth splitting as black ichor oozed down its chin. "Why are you still here?" it hissed, the sound slithering into Jack's ears. He screamed, swinging the camera wildly. The screen flickered and glitched, showing distorted images of the cabin, the figure, and something else. Shapes in the shadows, moving and shifting, too many to count. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of agony that filled his head, threatening to split it open. Jack dropped the camera, clutching his ears as he fell to his knees. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Let me go." The figure loomed over him, tilting its head as though considering his plea. Then it spoke again, its voice soft but laced with menace. "The forest doesn't let go, but it will take its time with you." Jack's vision blurred, the darkness around him shifting and swirling. The cabin seemed to dissolve, the walls bending and stretching as though alive. The ground beneath him split open, revealing a void of writhing shadows. He felt himself falling. When Jack woke, he was lying on the edge of the forest. The village lay just ahead, its cobblestone streets bathed in the pale light of dawn. His clothes were damp, caked with mud, and his body ached as though he'd been dragged for miles. But he was alive. Somehow he was alive. Jack staggered to his feet, every step toward the village feeling like an eternity. The villagers stared at him as he entered, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. Greta, the woman from the general store, rushed out to meet him, her eyes wide. "You made it out?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached into his bag, fumbling for the camera. He had to show them to prove what had happened. But when he powered it on, there was nothing. The footage was gone. No shadows, no figures, no whispers. Just empty static. "You shouldn't have gone in," Greta said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "The forest doesn't forget." Jack wanted to argue, to tell her he had made it out, that he was safe. But as he opened his mouth, a faint sound stopped him cold. The whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but he recognized it instantly. Spoke his name. Jack's blood ran cold as he looked back toward the forest. The trees loomed in the distance, dark and unyielding, their shadows stretching toward him like claws. He realized the truth in that moment. The forest had let him leave, but it hadn't let him go. And it never would.